Hello, this is Archbishop Paul-André Durocher of the Archdiocese of Gatineau. I'd like to take a few minutes of your time to present to you the working document, what they call the instrumentum laboris, the working document for the second session of the Synod of Bishops on the theme of synodality. Now, the title of this second session is quite focused, How to be a Missionary Synodal Church. Last year, the first session, last October, was quite broad in scope. It studied all the responses gathered from around the world around what synodality is about, what a synodal church should look like, things that people were concerned about. This session will be focused more precisely on the question of the how. How do we become a more missionary synodal church? I think this is going to be important for us as we move ahead. So the document starts by reminding us of the 3 years that we've spent on the road up to now. It reminds us of the diocesan, regional, national, and continental conferences that were held in view of the first session held last October 2023. Since then, there have been further consultations, both in diocesan groups and with various working groups throughout the world. And this has led to the writing of this second instrumentum laboris working document in view of the session that will start at the beginning of October in 2024, in a couple of months. So the document then goes on to speak about foundations. It's an introduction, you could say, that reminds us of some of the conclusions from last year's gathering. So the first of all, to remind us about synodality being, we remind ourselves that it means to walk together, literally, to walk together. So as a church, we walk together following Christ, all of us, all the baptized, whether we are ordained or not, whether we are men or women, whether we are religious or lay people, all of us, we are walking together and we are following Christ. This is the church's particular style. It's the church's way. You could say it's a style of being and it's a style of functioning. So this is what synodality is about. And it's not an end in itself. The point isn't to be synodal just to be synodal. It's in view of the common mission we have. The church has a mission to the world. Synodality is the best way for us to collaborate and to work together in realizing and fulfilling that mission. And part of synodality means moving forward together in unity, which is the harmony of diversity. So it's not in uniformity, but it's in unity, recognizing the great diversity that there is within the church. One of the foundational, you might say, essential differences that we experience is the difference between men and women. So the importance of learning reciprocity between men and women in this journey. And in order to journey together, to be able to live that unity, we need to learn to listen to each other deeply through deep listening. So these are the foundations that emanated from the last session. So that's the introduction. The rest of the document will be organized in 3 broad chapters. And the first chapter is called Relations. We could give it another title. We could say, put it as a question. Who do we walk with? Who do we live synodality with? The second section will be about how do we do it, and the third will be where do we do it. But this first section is about who do we do it with? So relations, and each of these sections has 4 subsections, or the chapters has 4 subsections. And here in relationships, who do we do it with? First of all, we do it with Christ and in the Spirit. And if we're not in relationship with Christ, if we are not living in the Spirit, then there's no point in speaking about synodality. Synodality can only be lived because we are all baptized. We've all been plunged into the death and resurrection of Christ in baptism. That is our common dignity, the common priesthood of all the children of God. and in the common spirit. And we experience that in a special way in Eucharist when we gather in the diversity of who we are, all the places we might come from. And the fact is, we are all gathered around Christ, who speaks to us and nourishes us in his body and in his blood. So this is the first set of relationships that are foundational. The second set are the relations we have with each other in the church as we bring our gifts to the service of the church, the service of the people of God. These gifts which are given by the Spirit, first of all, there are the gifts which each of us have, great or small. We all have gifts to allow us to take our part in the mission. So the charisms, what we call the charisms, and then ministries. Ministries are recognized services, established, recognized by the people of God, mandated by the authorities in the church to be able to take on a certain responsibility. And there are ordained ministries, but here this part of the chapter focuses on various lay ministries, and it calls for great creativity in identifying new ministries, in forming new people to new ministries. And it ends by mentioning perhaps one ministry that we need in the church right now is a ministry of welcoming and of listening. And then it speaks about ordained ministers. We journey with ordained ministers, but here it's very interesting. The instrumentum laboris calls for a review of our understanding of ordained ministry within a synodal church. That ordained ministry is at the service of harmony. It's a ministry of service. It is not a power. It is not an authority of power that imposes itself, but one rather that fosters the gifts of the many people and helps them to collaborate with each other in bringing forward, in realizing the church's mission. So this passage invites us to reflect on ordained ministry within the context of a truly synodal church. And finally, we journey among the churches, between local churches. For example, here the Archdiocese of Gatineau is one local church, but we are not alone. We travel with our sister churches all around us, the Archdiocese of Ottawa to the south of us, and to the north and east of us, there's the Diocese of Saint-Jérôme-Mont-Laurier, and to the west, there's the Diocese of Pembroke, and we're part of the Assembly of Quebec Bishops, but also part of the Canadian Council, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. But speaking of the Canadian Council of Churches, which brings together Protestants and Anglicans and Orthodox and Catholics, then those relationships are not just lived among Catholic churches, but with other churches in the world and even with other religious groups. And I love this photo of Pope Francis, who's gathered with other leaders of religious groups throughout the world. In the world, we have to live the concreteness of communion. This is what this section is all about. So this ends that first chapter on who do we journey with? Relations. The second chapter asks the question of, I'm sorry, the title is in French. I forgot to change the title. Parcours, the journey. The question is, how do we journey? What processes do we follow? So the first section speaks about the need for integral and shared formation to listening and discerning. The reality is that we are not used to living a synodal church. We're more used to a hierarchical, very pyramid structure in the church with authority telling others what to do and people obeying and doing it. In a synodal church where really we come together to discern, it's not that there's no longer authority. Authority still has a place, that it still has a role, but that role is different. And so we all need to learn how to journey together in a synodal church. And we need integral formation, integral in the sense that it is not just addressed to the head, but it's also addressed to the heart. It's a question of knowledge, it's a question of willing, of understanding with the heart, but it's also a question of capacity, of ability. We need to know how to do it. So we need to learn how to listen, and we need to learn how to discern together, to discern God's will. And the second question in the process is discernment, particularly for mission. How as a church do we discern where God is calling us? How do we figure out what God is calling his church to be or to become? And so some of the elements that are mentioned in this section are the need for prayer, for meditation of scripture, for listening to reality, the reality that surrounds us, spiritual conversation. That was part of what we lived as we entered into the consultation process, that method of listening to each other to truly discern together where God is calling us, consensus building in the Spirit, reformulation by those who are in authority, and reception by those who receive this, who are called to receive this, and validation. The people who are part of the process need to be able to say, yes, we recognize ourselves in this. So all of that is part of ecclesial discerning for mission. We also have to figure out, and I've mentioned this before, is how does the whole consultation, listening, discerning process fit with the authority structure in the church? We could make the difference between decision making, you could say, where we kind of thrash the questions together, discuss the questions, reflect on them, confront them to scripture, to the tradition of the church, try to figure out where the Spirit is calling us, and ultimately the decision taking that has to be taken by people who are in authority, who are entrusted with that authority. And how do the two pieces mesh together? It's not enough to say that there's a consultative process which is merely consultative, and then somebody decides. It wouldn't make sense for those who decide to basically ignore what was done in the consultation, and they have to be part of that consultation process themselves. So that often the decision taking is a confirmation of the decision making process. All of this needs to be studied and needs to be deepened. And finally, a synodal church needs to be much more transparent. We have to learn accountability, and we need to open ourselves to evaluation of our work, evaluation of church ministers, whether they're ordained or non-ordained, evaluation of teamworks, evaluation of ministries in the church. All of this needs to be part of a synodal church. And there's a lot to be learned here, I think, in this area. So the final chapter of the working document, the instrumentum laboris, asks the questions, well, where do we need to be doing this? So first of all, who do we journey with? How do we journey? And where do we journey? And one of the things we need to realize in today's world is that this sense of belonging has changed. It used to be our belonging was very territorial. You belonged to a village, you belonged to a neighborhood, you were born in that village or that neighborhood, you lived your whole life in it. That was your parish from birth till death, practically. I've heard of priests who were parish priests for 50 years in the same parish with the same parishioners. This is no longer true, because of the phenomenon of urbanization globally, the phenomenon of mass mobility throughout the world, and the internet. Of course, the internet. Belonging now is much more a question of networks and spheres of relationships rather than where you live geographically. And we need to take that into consideration. But there are three major levels where we can work at creating that greater unity in the synodal church. And the first level is at the local level, the diocesan level, local churches in the one and unique Catholic Church. It needs to become more a community of communities. The dioceses, parishes, have to recognize that with various movements and associations and various cultures and groupings, that unity is lived in that great diversity of communities we become a community of communities. And for that, we need to strengthen and renew the various places where we can come together to reflect the various councils that help synodality to flourish. And then the second place is at the national level, the bonds that shape the unity of the church, the role of episcopal conferences. Here's a picture of members of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Churches, and if you have good eyes, you'll see me at the back there in the nearly last row. The Episcopal conferences are places where we can bring common concerns and work together to share our riches. In the sharing of gifts with each other, we can grow the church throughout our country. And finally, at the international level, there's the service to unity of the Bishop of Rome, and how that service to unity can be fostered, can be bolstered and strengthened. Here we see the Pope when he came to Canada to meet with our Indigenous communities. The Pope has already started to, you could say, reform the Curia, the group of people that work with him and help him to make it more synodal, to make it more missionary. We need to continue to focus on that role of the Pope. So those are the questions related to where do we need to grow as a synodal church. So the conclusion just brings us back to the fact that synodality, a synodal church, it exists for the sake of the mission to the world. We are in this world, and as we learn to become more synodal, we can have a greater impact in the world, both in terms of the efficiency of our evangelization, but also as we become a better living sign of God's love for the world as we grow in unity in diversity. God knows our world needs this gift. I hope this quick presentation helps you have a sense of what this working document is about and what the bishops will be talking about in October. If you want to read the whole text, you can find it on the internet, the site www.synod, synod.va, VA for Vatican. So www.synod.va, you'll find all the documents, including this working document for the second session. And already we can start praying for the success and the fruitfulness of this session. Let us hold those who will be participating in this second session of the Synod of Bishops. Let us hold them in our hearts and in our prayer. God bless.